If there is a golden rule in Hollywood, it's probably that nothing succeeds quite like repetition. Or, if it doesn't succeed, then at least it gives you space to cover your own ass when the sci-fi fantasy movie you greenlit in the wake of Star Wars underperformed or outright bombed. This in itself is quite ironic when you consider George Lucas famously shopped his movie pitch, Star Wars, to every studio in town and was rejected by every studio in town until meeting Alan Ladd Jr. at Fox, who decided to roll the dice on the director of American Graffiti, at the time the most profitable film ever made, and greenlit Lucas's story of a galaxy a long time ago and far away. So Star Wars comes out, and what does Hollywood do? Start frantically looking for sci-fi projects like Star Wars to get in front of camera as soon as possible. Those same studios that showed Lucas the door a few years earlier were now hungry for that dreaded 21st century buzzword content. And in time, Hollywood delivered. In the case of today's subject, quite quickly too. You see, what resulted in the wake of Star Wars was a golden opportunity for Lucas's competitors, a roughly 3-year stretch to fill the marketplace with as many pretenders to the Lucas throne to grab as much of the Star Wars audience as possible. This is the story of one of those efforts. This is the story of Battlestar Galactica. Okay, hang on. Wait. All right, I know what you're thinking. You thought this was a show about the magic of the movies, about seeing movies in the theater. I've spent the last 3 episodes banging on about the importance of the cinema-going experience. The popcorn, the soda, the coming attractions, the dimming lights, and the parting curtains. Not campy 70s sci-fi TV shows that lasted 1 season before being unceremoniously cancelled, then revived into an even campier, even shorter-lived revamp a year later. What the ever-loving heck does Battlestar Galactica have to do with the grand cinematic experience? Well, I'll explain. So it came to pass in 1978 that we, my family and I, left those suburban streets of Mississauga, Ontario, and moved across country, settling in Vancouver, British Columbia, just in time to begin kindergarten that autumn. Now, compared to the bland, flat geography of the metropolitan Toronto area, North Vancouver was a paradise of dense woods and ravines, places where a child's imagination could run wild. My school was a short 10-minute walk up the street, and heading down either Lynn Valley Road or Mountain Highway towards the lower mainland afforded a panoramic view of Vancouver and parts beyond laid out before like a miniature village. I began kindergarten that fall and made friends quickly. We bonded over Star Wars naturally, and backyard playtimes felt endless. It was that free-range existence we 70s kids pretty much enjoyed. We roamed unaccompanied with nothing more than telling Mom, I'm going to Cameron's, or asking, is it all right if Barry comes over? We were told to call when we got to where we were going, and pretty much left to it. And, of course, woe betides any child who doesn't call home and provoke the wrath of a mother on the prowl to find where the heck you are. It was a different era. We had kid-friendly movie matinees at a local theater, the name of which is lost to me right now, but I saw my first Ray Harryhausen movies there. There were swim lessons at a YMCA pool. There were birthdays at a McDonald's with an actual indoor McDonald Playland play area. There were train rides to Squamish and Whistler, ferries to Victoria, car trips to the Flintstones' Bedrock Village, a family-friendly theme park centered on 60s cartoon family of the Flintstones, which was still very popular in 1978. And there were shopping trips stateside to Bellingham, Washington, where all the coolest, newest Star Wars toys could be found months before they showed up in Canadian stores. I'm sure the bias of age and experience is speaking here, but for me it was a glorious time to be a child. It seemed everywhere we looked there was something new to captivate our eyeballs and dazzle our senses on screens big and small.
They are searching for a star called Earth. to fight a great war. Battlestar Galactica takes you to undreamed-of worlds, engaged in a war so devastating it might change history. Did it happen eons ago, or will it happen tomorrow? Battlestar Galactica, in Sense-Around at most theaters, rated PG.
To speak of Battlestar Galactica, subtitled The Saga of a Star World, is to speak of its principal mover and shaker, the great, and I mean it, Glenn A. Larson. I don't use the word great lightly either, for his body of work through the 1970s and well into the 1980s is a legacy of television series that have all become iconic in their own rights. Quincy MD, Battlestar Galactica, The Fall Guy, Magnum PI, and a show you'll know solely by the sound of its opening music, Knight Rider. To be creator of just one of those shows puts you in the pantheon of creators who crafted iconic works and characters that have stood the test of time. Galactica's existence, though, came about with a confluence of fate and good timing. Larson first had the idea for Galactica, a story that is essentially Wagon Train in space meets Hot Rods of the Gods, years before Star Wars arrived on the scene. It was a dream project of his, that one every TV and film writer has in his or her desk drawer, because even they know an expensive proposition such as a Galactica is a risk to any TV network or studio. But then Star Wars began breaking records, and seemingly every writer-producer in Hollywood was being called into the studios to see if they had the next Star Wars. Larson had Galactica. Star Wars was budgeted at $11 million. Saga of a Star World, henceforth referred to as just Galactica, came in at $8 million for a aired in 3 parts 145-minute TV series pilot. By that metric, Galactica should have provided more bang for its buck than Star Wars, which, hard to believe now, is the only movie in the Star Wars saga that clocks in at just 2 hours. As to why I saw Galactica in the theater, we need to delve a little deeper into the mechanics of movie-going in 1978. Beginning with Jaws, but probably stretching back to The Godfather and The Exorcist, the 4-quadrant blockbuster had become the studio's holy grail. Yes, edgy, independently spirited, if still studio-financed films like Martin Scorsese's Mean Streets and Hal Ashby's Harold and Maude brought in the younger crowds, while the olds gravitated to disaster movies like The Towering Inferno and Earthquake. This was the 1970s, the era of gritty adult filmmaking beloved of critics and their particular audiences. While critics today will point to movies like Network and Annie Hall as the groundbreaking cinematic works they genuinely are, moviegoing in the 1970s was also as much about Walking Tall, Smokey and the Bandit, The Legend of Boggy Creek, and Moonraker. Audiences were increasingly becoming benumbed to gritty films about angry men and lonely women and were thirsting for something escapist. Or, to paraphrase Harvey Bennett, the producer of the Star Trek movies, in a quote I will come back to eventually and probably multiple times, having a turkey sandwich every day makes Thanksgiving dinner feel a lot less special. Then along came a 25-foot great white, all 3 tons of her, to deliver that escapism. Steven Spielberg's Jaws was the movie everyone young and old wanted to see, and see it they did, in some cases multiple times. Following Jaws, those 4 quadrants, males and females, over 25 and under, became the audience the studios wanted. Jaws, despite going over schedule and over budget, earned $475 million worldwide on its $9 million budget. Soon enough, the movies looked a lot more like that 25-foot shark than it did deranged taxi driver Travis Bickle. Now, Galactica had always been intended for television, hence its 145-minute runtime. But like Jaws, it too was an expensive production, costing a lot more than Universal could ever expect to recoup in its first year of airing unless it became a massive hit, and even then it would struggle. So Universal decided to re-edit that 145 minutes down to a more manageable 2 hours and release it theatrically in limited markets to recoup some of the high production costs, and hopefully capture some of that Star Wars audience they knew was out there, because Star Wars was still playing in theaters a year on from its 1977 release. When worries of such a release cheapening the Galactica experience were raised, the planned 75-screen release would happen only in that reliable neighbor to the north of Canada and across Europe. If Galactica was to bomb, let it do so quietly was the reasoning. And in the 1970s, despite being next-door neighbors, Canada and the US might as well have been on opposite sides of the planet. That's where I come in. By 1978, my dad was in his early 30s and an executive at Imperial Oil with 2 children and a wife at home. This was back in the day when a single parent could provide for their entire family and provide quite well. He worked long hours and took many business trips, and it wasn't uncommon to go the entire school week without seeing him at all. As such, on the weekends when he was around, that was his time to spend with his kids and to give my harried mother a break from the 2 of us. Through his job, he knew many young newlywed guys, and they talked about sports and TV and also movies. Not only did they talk about them, they went to them too. A quick call home to say he'd be back late, and Dad would be off to a quick burger and beer, followed by a screening of The Fog, Apocalypse Now, or The Deer Hunter. So it was again when one of the guys at work heard about Dad's Star Wars-obsessed son. He mentioned there was a movie coming to theaters that July called Battlestar Galactica. Frankly, any movie was enough to get me out of the house to the theater, so on a weekend not long after, we went to, I think, was a pretty basic, simple 2-screen cinema, the likes of which are an extinct breed today. I want to say it was either the Park Royal or the Odeon West, both of which were in North and West Vancouver, near us, but both of those are long gone anyway, victims to, I guess, just the passage of time. Galactica is all about time. We discovered this from its opening moments as the tones of Patrick Macnee, who also voiced the Cylons Imperia's leader and would later appear as the sinister Count Ebly in the 2-part episode War of the Gods, tells us over a starscape.
There are those who believe that life here began out there, far across the universe, with tribes of humans who may have been the forefathers of the Egyptians, or the Toltecs, or the Mayans. Some believe that there may yet be brothers of man who even now fight to survive somewhere beyond the heavens.
To a 5-year-old, it was all over my head, but if you were an adult of the 1970s, you knew we were in Eric Van Daniken Chariots of the Gods territory. Fortunately, this ponderous narration just set the table for the meal to follow. We're in a distant, unnamed star system, described as the 7th millennium of time, where humanity, scattered across 12 planetary colonies, have engaged in a centuries-old war against a robotic race known as the Cylons, determined to exterminate mankind. But for reasons unspecified, the Cylons have petitioned for an end to the war through a human emissary named Baltar, and the leaders of the 12 colonies have gathered on the planet Caprica to sign a peace accord. Of course, things aren't so cut and dried, and the suspicious commander of the Galactica, Adama, is proven too correct as the Cylons launch a surprise attack on Caprica and the other colonial worlds, nearly wiping humanity out in one swift stroke. The survivors, led by Adama, his son Apollo, cocky pilot Starbuck, daughter Athena, and a ragtag fugitive fleet of surviving humans, must flee the Cylon tyranny and attempt to find refuge at the legendary lost 13th colony, to find a place to call home, to mount a defense as the Cylons close in. The lost 13th colony is, of course, Earth, and that journey across the stars to a planet that may exist only in legend forms the crux of the pilot film Saga of a Star World and the ensuing series.
Mattel introduces the Battlestar Galactica collection. You can imagine the Viper launch station against the evil Cylons.
Colonial Viper's ready.
Spaceport open.
Look, Cylon Raiders. Launch for squadron. Missed one. Reset catapult. Viper's on target.
Viper launch station, not for use with other Battlestar Galactica vehicles. You put it together. New from Mattel.
We could see that Galactica's ambitions out of the gate were much more impressive than the standard, and far more so than one would expect from a late 1970s TV show, with characters like Adama and Apollo, but also Sheba, Cassiopeia, and Athena, recalling mythical figures across a variety of Earth culture. The lost 13th colony of Earth was, according to Larson, always to be a mystery. The characters of Galactica could have been our ancestors, they could have been our descendants. The Earth they eventually found could have been thousands of years in our past or thousands in our future. In fact, the colonials of Galactica themselves could have originated on Earth and departed that home thousands of years prior. Two of the battle stars destroyed in Galactica are named Pacifica and Atlantia, after all, and the helmets of the colonial warrior pilots are Egyptian in design. We simply didn't know, and it could be surmised Larson didn't quite know either. It only came in the final episode of the first season where we, not the characters, eavesdrop a broadcast of the Apollo moon landings to peg Galactica as taking place sometime post-1969. Maybe that was the plan all along, but I doubt it. It smacks of the network wanting a resolution to move the story along quicker, akin to solving Laura Palmer's murder midway through the second season of Twin Peaks. And we all know how that turned out. Despite the intriguing premise of the story, the first act of Saga, comprising the Peace Summit, the Cylon attack, and Adama's desperate gambit to prevent a Holocaust, remains the strongest part of the overall film. Once the literal and figurative dust settles, we're on our way across the galaxy and into TV territory as the film settles into those sets and sound stages that will become Galactica's home for the 24 episodes that will comprise the entirety of its run. But that's all history, pop cultural history. In the context of that afternoon in July on the North Shore, this 5-year-old thought Battlestar Galactica was the coolest thing he'd seen since Star Wars. He identified the grandfatherly Lorne Greene as Adama. He found an admirable heroic figure in Richard Hatch's Apollo. And like most kids his age, he aspired to be as cool as Dirk Benedict's Starbuck. He wasn't much of a fan of Noah Hathaway's Boxy, though, but more out of jealousy than any dislike of the actor or character. Even now, 45 years later, I can still hear the whistles and cheers in the theater as the Colonial Fleet's Viper fighters rocketed to intercept the Cylon Raiders and their base star over the planet Carillon in the movie's climax. It didn't really strike me as odd that a couple of months later Battlestar Galactica would arrive on TV, first in the expanded 3-part saga of A Star World, then in a run of episodes following that were, frankly, quite solid. The first half of Galactica's only full season contained many memorable 2-part episodes, from The Living Legend and Lost Planet of the Gods. Over time, the scrappy TV show would win me over by sheer dint of a new Galactica story once a week, all through later 1978 and into 1979. It wasn't the flavor per se, so much as the volume of Galactica. With 24-hour-long episodes, more or less, it would take Star Wars nearly 30 years of big and small screen adventuring to roughly equal Galactica's one and only season runtime. I think Galactica's principal flaw as a movie, in the end, I think it all boiled down to one simple thing, and that was character. Because this was television, circa 1978, the characters had to remain static. They had to remain archetypes. Commander Adama had to remain the gruff, stoic, elder military statesman, dispensing wisdom and commanding leadership. Apollo had to be the by-the-books tactical officer driven by tragedy and by duty. Starbuck had to be the smooth, suave, slightly comedic ladies' man. Every week and every episode of Galactica, we had to know who these characters were and who they would again be the week and episode following. There could be change during an episode, that test of character and resolve, but by the week following, everyone had to be back where they had been before. This was serialized, non-serialized storytelling. You could watch episodes out of order, you could watch them in order, but they would remain roughly the same. The events of previous episodes, with 1 or 2 exceptions, had no real impact beyond them. Despite being a story about a journey to a distant world, there was little of this long-form serialized storytelling we would see in the 2000s Galactica reboot. Galactica 78 is very much a product of its times, a series that can be largely viewed out of sequence without really missing anything. Baltar and the Cylons are foiled repeatedly, always down for the count, but never completely out of it, before fading from the narrative altogether as the series meanders to a memorable, but not quite memorable enough finale. Contrast that with the character arcs in Star Wars, particularly Luke and Han. The characters in Saga of a Star World do not change or evolve or develop beyond who we see them as at the beginning. As this fleet defeats another Cylon surprise attack and rockets off into the unknown quarters of their galaxy, everyone is again as we left them and will encounter again. There are no major losses, save one, which I will not get into. It's no small wonder that while I liked Starbuck and Apollo as characters thanks to the charismatic actors, Dirk Benedict and Richard Hatch respectively, who portrayed them, they didn't cut as deeply as a Luke Skywalker and Obi-Wan Kenobi, and certainly as a Darth Vader. Now, this all seems very negative, and negativity is one thing I try to avoid on this podcast. The fact that I'm spending all this time talking about Battlestar Galactica should indicate I hold a lot of fondness and affection for this movie and TV series. Compared to Star Wars, the subsequent movie versions of Star Trek, and sci-fi classics like Blade Runner even, Galactica certainly gets the short end of the stick. This was television, after all, long considered the inferior format, with stories placed in prime time solely for the commercial breaks to shill Tide, Hamburger Helper, and steak dinners at Ponderosa. Galactica was shot on a fast schedule, with effects repurposed and reused ad infinitum. So much so that watching it, we could predict which effects shot was next. Seeing a Colonial Viper blast a Cylon Raider to dust, then flying through the cloud of vapor was cool once. Every time, not so much. It was the costs of mounting an ambitious weekly sci-fi adventure series that would prove to be its biggest hurdle to overcome. The scale and scope of Galactica began to atrophy almost immediately, though over its series run, genuinely great standout episodes like The Living Legend with Lloyd Bridges and the Guns of Navarone-inspired Gun on Ice Planet Zero were both quite memorable, and for my money, much more entertaining than Saga of a Star World. In the end, Galactica was undone by its soaring costs. There simply wasn't enough money in a Star Saga on the small screen, not when BG and the Bear were waiting in the wings.
Bear Enterprises, Evil Anything Anywhere, it's BJ McKay.
BJ's mixing business with pleasure with his new lady partners.
Come on, BJ, we can handle it.
It's Smokey and the Bandit ×7.
Oh, yes.
And even the law can't slow them up, because there ain't no stopping them now. BJ and the Lady Truckers, Tuesday at 9, 8 Central and Mountain.
Galactica might have been more successful had it stuck to its original plan. It was never really intended to be an ongoing TV series, rather a series of TV movies to air every other month, possibly, to keep the story going and keep people tuning in. What was originally conceived as a 3-part TV miniseries event with subsequent telefilms to continue the story was changed by the network, who decided midway through Saga's shoot to make Galactica a weekly television series. This put Team Galactica behind the proverbial 8-ball, a position they never quite recovered from, though they would try. Everything in Galactica has an avatar with Star Wars, with the chrome-plated Cylons obvious stormtrooper stand-ins, the sinister base stars as small fleets of Death Stars, an imperious leader seated in shadow like the mysterious Emperor, unseen in Star Wars and only fleetingly in The Empire Strikes Back. There's even a nightclub packed with aliens, a disco planet. I and friends would jokingly refer to it when we rediscovered Galactica on home video in the 1990s. That's an obvious stand-in for Star Wars' iconic cantina scene. There remains much to admire about Galactica. It swung for the bleachers and scored some solid hits along the way. While it is easy to come down hard on Galactica's often lackluster contents, the fact remains, for a child the right age as I was, it was a wonderful experience, and seeing it in the theater likely had something to do with that first impression. I couldn't stop talking about it. In addition, Galactica, the show, was probably the first TV series I remember obsessively watching and following. It was my first true foray into weekly episodic television, where I had to follow a story while also paying attention to the overall arc. While not as rigidly serialized as its later 2000s reboot, I find on my preference scale, Battlestar 1978 easily beats the reboot. With the former, despite being an ongoing saga, you could drop in wherever you wanted and whenever you wanted, and be able to follow everything. Galactica would fade from the public memory after its cancellation the following spring. The show was just too expensive to keep producing for the ratings it was receiving. It was pretty much forgotten by the time The Empire Strikes Back arrived in May of 1980. The Colonial Viper fighters, the Cylon Raiders, the action figures, toys, and games disappeared in a garage sale at some point later. A shame too, because those toys sell for big bucks on eBay now. Until its 2003 reboot, Battlestar Galactica was and would remain a late 1970s curio, soon swallowed by the sheer weight of genre TV and movies that would come to dominate the 1980s. But for kids like me, who never forgot the thrill of finishing dinner, clearing the table, and seeing to whatever chores and homework needed to be done before we could settle into the living room sofa, turn the TV on, and hear those mysterious first words, there are those who believe that life here began out there. It was a truly magical time. Which brings us to the end of this episode of Celluloid Heroes. I think I'm getting the hang of it. There are certainly fewer ums and uhs than previous, so I guess that's a win. This episode of Celluloid Heroes is the first of a mini trilogy I like to call Attack of the Killer Bees. Each will spotlight a movie released in that 3-year gap between Star Wars and The Empire Strikes Back, each of which also begins with the letter B. I'm sure you can guess what the other two are, but until then, you'll have to wait until next month's installment. I can be reached at bradabraham.com, my website, and on multivariate social media platforms at NotBradAbraham. This has been Celluloid Heroes. Thanks for listening.
And now, we near the end of our journey. That planet which is home to our ancestor brothers. We have at last found